think we're all back. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, the man who really doesn't need an introduction, but I am going to give him one because I love talking into the microphone. Ben Milne. Ben Milne is the founder and CEO of Dwolla. Dwolla is a payment startup building the ideal API to move money. Under Ben, the Des Moines-based company has raised over $40 million from investors like Union Square Ventures, Foundry Group, and Union Square Ventures. So double up on that one. Dwolla has been recognized by Fast Company as one of the world's 50 most innovative companies. The Dwolla software platform is used to power billions of dollars in commerce annually by fast-growing technology companies all over the country. Ben himself has been named one of Forbes' Disruptors of the Year and has appeared on Inc. magazines in its annual 30 Under 30 collection, Bloomberg TV, and The Today Show. He was also recognized for his work by MIT Technology Review in its annual Innovators Under 35 list. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ben Milne to the stage.
Thank you. You guys definitely got the PR heavy intro, didn't you? Thank you very much for having me. My name is Ben Milne. I'm very accessible through Twitter. If you want to get a hold of me, have a public conversation, it's just BP Milne. If you want to get a hold of me and have a private conversation, either because you have something really mean to say or just that you don't want to publicly, my email is b@Dwolla. If you cannot spell that, maybe we don't need to talk. But I try to respond to everything as soon as I can, but every once in a while it takes me a couple days to respond. Oh no. My slides are in got to unlock the computer mode. So I don't know if somebody wants to have a conversation about something else while I fix this. Sorry, guys.
That's my cue. It's my cue to do some improv for you. Get ready. It's going to be really funny. Okay. I looked up jokes online. I actually Googled startup jokes for this very moment, and I can't remember any of them. I'll tell you a funny story. So we've talked a lot today about funnels and converting people from prospects to closed clients. We do a screen share and a live demo at Volunteer Local, and one time I left the screen share on after the demo was over and decided to check my Facebook and write snarky comments to my ex-boyfriend, but not actually send them. And then she messaged me inside the screen sharing app and was like, "Hey Kaylee, I'm sure you're great, don't worry about it." It was very nice. We did get the client. Okay.
Thank you. Gracefully done. Thank you very much. So I know I'm supposed to give you guys a whole bunch of investor wisdom today, but I can't. I can only give you context and some stories about some of the things that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of. A lot of things that haven't worked, a few things that did, and a whole bunch of other shit in between that we'll just see where the day takes us. I don't know if we can get my slides up. Oh, they're over there. So the sort of thesis of today's talk is that you choose your path. I get that that's not the topic of the talk, but you're in control of your destiny. There are lots of different ways to be successful, and some of those involve investors. Some of them don't. You create your own path, and there is no prescriptive, guaranteed way to make your company or your idea successful. It's up to you. The talk today is really titled, "When you launch your company, will have one or more investors." You always have at least one, and that starts with you. The question is, do you need others? Why? Where's it going to get you? And what are the advantages? I'm going to talk through a couple different projects that I've been involved with. Really, two of the companies I've ended up spending, one in my 20s and then one in my 30s. One is a software company, one is a hardware company, two very different businesses. One didn't raise capital, one has, and one has raised about $40 million so far, and I'm sure we'll raise more money at some point in time. When, who knows? When I talk about some of this stuff, Like, we talk about building platforms, and I've been fortunate to be a part of building platforms that serve millions of people, and in this case, service millions of people moving billions of dollars a year. Like, they're big numbers, but it's just BS. We have customers. Those customers pay us for our goods and services, and there's a similarity between this business and every other business, but sometimes these words get in the way of that because they just look big. Quite frankly, a lot of the time using these words is a good way to lose credibility. You know, when you think about my background, it's probably not too dissimilar than a lot of yours. Iowa born, Iowa raised, Iowa educated, at least through high school. I didn't graduate from college, which officially makes me the most uneducated person, well, certainly at the company I work in today, and virtually in every room that I'm in. That's okay. That doesn't bother me. I don't know if it bothers you guys, but building companies doesn't really have a lot to do with that. It has a lot to do with whether or not your product works, whether or not your customers love it, and maybe there's a point in time where you need additional capital, but maybe there's not. I don't really know anything about anything other than building companies. My wife nicely tries to say, well, I do because maybe I can cook a certain type of food well once a week or something like that, but in reality, like, this is all I know. So I'm humble enough to know that there is no right solution except for the one that's right for your business when it comes to raising capital. And when I think about what makes me different, well, I have the internet. I'm not afraid to ask the internet questions. That's where I get 99% of my answers. And I'm not afraid to fail. I think the second is probably more important than the first, and most of the things that I've learned in life are a result of my failures. I don't know what is the right thing for you or your company, and so I can only share my story, and hopefully you get some context and maybe a few learnings that will be helpful to you. If there's anything you think I can be helpful with, I live in Des Moines, Iowa. This is where I also work, thankfully. I was fortunate enough to spend a few years in the Bay Area, and I'm very happy to be back. So if there's anything I can do, just reach out. And I recognize that I'm still woefully inexperienced. I got into a heavily regulated market without necessarily understanding how regulation worked, connecting real-time technology to banking infrastructure that helped run the economy without really considering maybe I shouldn't be doing this. It is funny, and the world has reminded me many times that I clearly should not have, but I've learned a lot of things along the way. And life has given me a lot of really great opportunities, and many of those started with people in this room. So thank you for all the time that you guys have given me over the years. I'm also propped up by a really incredible team at home and at work. And I say at home specifically because I don't care what it is that you are doing at work. If things at home are not right, whether or not you are single or not, have many kids or no kids, whether or not you have a cat or a dog or just a plant, if your home life is not right, your work life is probably not going to be very good either. And while it sounds obvious and maybe to some people even a bit naive because home might be a distraction, it isn't. And so I want to make a point to get you guys to think about how your home life actually evolves with your work life. Because whether or not your company takes on investors will absolutely affect what's at home. So my story starts with my first company. I dropped out of college to start building an acoustics company. I wanted to be a musician, but I was a shitty musician. I wanted to be close to music. So I built a company that allowed me to be close to music. Made speakers. We got the word out through internet forums and doing things like building show cars. Seems really ridiculous, but as I was just talking to somebody 10 minutes ago who was working with somebody building an automotive company, it's a very real business. And it's a business where money isn't coming from investors, it's coming from actual customers. And money only comes from two places, customers or investors. That business grew from a $1,200 investment to a little over $1 million in revenue in about 4 years, and I owned 100% of it. I didn't know what to do with it. One day I decided that I was unhappy, so I walked the employees out and offered to sell them the company, and they took me up on it and bought the company. Super stupid. I'll talk a little bit about that. I actually should have raised money into this company because investors that were good could have helped me. That company had one growth mode, and I think it's important to start thinking about what's your growth mode? Do you need somebody else's money to accomplish that growth mode? And then what are you going to do with it? So I didn't raise any money in that business because I didn't know what outside capital was. I didn't actually start trying to figure out what venture capital was because I never searched that in Google before. I actually needed more money than I had. That was it. Most of you are way ahead of where I was. Now, the insights for that company were not incredibly unique. I wanted to make more sound in smaller boxes. I designed things for my own listening taste. I learned how to do engineering around acoustics because I wanted things to sound like I liked them to sound. I didn't like how they sounded from other companies, so I changed it. And apparently when I sold it, other people liked that too. And I sold direct to the consumer, so no traditional distribution, everything just direct. That's a very common thing today, but 10 years ago, it wasn't necessarily a common thing in that particular industry. And so I think when I consider whether or not a business should take in outside capital, I think about what are the advantages to that business to taking in outside capital, and many times it's long-term thinking. An example in this business was, I thought that I was constricted in my market size. An outside investor would have helped me understand, assuming I found similar ones that I did in my current company, that I was thinking about what I did well completely wrong. I didn't own an audio company, I owned a manufacturing company and an engineering company that could have served many different markets. I just was too busy in my head to get around it. I was also really worried about the cost of dealing with distributors because, as everybody who uses distributors know, distributors eat your margin. Now, if you own 100% of something, why do you want to give away your margin? Of course you don't. You want to defend it. And what I didn't realize is that I was thinking really short term, and had I actually put some money into marketing, I could have gone around the distributors directly to the end customer, which is what I was already doing. I was just too busy to figure it out. And I also thought there was too much reliance on foreign producers. I was too young and naive to consider that if I just step back a little bit and get a little bit of extra capital, I could have actually produced the products better and more consistently than the overseas partners I had were. Not a bad deal. Again, long-term thinking, short-term thinking. It's really, 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 really hard to think long-term when you're always executing short-term. And it's a difficult thing when you're building a business that you care passionately about. You start to come up with all these little justifications for the way that you're doing everything all the time. But you're so close to it that you might actually not see what it could become. And I think where you're starting to come out and think, well, what is this business really going to be in 5 or 10 years? And is outside capital something that helps me do that or hurts me in doing it? If it helps you, maybe do it. If it doesn't, just don't. Some things in life are that binary. With this company, my big learning lesson was in my super dumb exit. Not everybody is an operator. Not everybody can actually run a company. And again, had I had investors and advisors when I was selling that company, had I had the same advisors I found 3 years later, I would probably still own it, or at least a massive percentage of it, and it would probably still exist, but instead, the people I sold it to ran it into the ground because they didn't know what they were doing. I was so short-sighted that all I wanted to do was work on another project, and I thought that it could provide a good life for the team after it had provided a really good life for me. Again, short-term versus long-term. Once I sold that company, which, again, not my finest hour, looked good on paper initially, I transitioned into working in my current company, which is Dwolla. That happened maybe 7 years ago. I can't remember when you and I first met, Mike. And it was interesting when I sat down today. I remember I applied or put my idea into a business plan competition, which I think was the Papa John competition, for money to try and get it off the ground. Clearly, I got nowhere with that. I never received a call back. I wasn't allowed to come in and pitch. It just didn't fit the mold, and that was okay. But I figured it out, and I feel like it's worked since then. The company has really been built around a couple very simple things. And those simple things have driven 2 different growth modes. Both of those growth modes have required investors. And is there anybody in the room who works in finance? Few people. So as anybody who works in finance knows, technology requirements, capital requirements, regulatory requirements, compliance requirements, information security requirements, all of these things are very real. You can't get them wrong. And there are very real laws that dictate how you do things. I've been running a manufacturing company and decided I was going to use the internet to connect banks together more efficiently. Does that sound like a good pitch for a big bank? There are videos of me on the internet not too long after this time talking about how we were actually going to create a system to allow you to do real-time exchanges across the world while bypassing central banks. Also, does that sound like a really great way to start a conversation when you're talking about we're going to build this product in a heavily regulated environment? Absolutely not. We've come a long way and built a very real business, but even to get there, to start it, I had 70 grand into the company and I was the first money in, and I needed more capital. In fact, at one point in time, I thought I needed about $10 million to actually just start taking on my first customers. What we ended up figuring out after 2 years of running in circles was that we could pull it off for a few million, which comparatively speaking is not a lot, but when you compare it to how much money I had left at the time, which was zero, it seemed like a pretty meaningful amount of money. So as you can see with this particular company, like the only way to see it into the market was to raise outside capital, which is why I did it originally. The things that were key insights for that business and things that still hold true today is that we focused on making every transaction electronic. Transactions are expensive and slow, largely because of old technology utilized between parties, and honestly, that really just means old technology. A lot of the things that were built right now that are being used today were built around the same time as when rotary phones were being produced. So when you think about the advances in telecommunications versus the advances in payments technology at a core architecture level, there's a huge jump that is going to occur, and we've been focusing on trying to lead that jump for years. We don't touch the money. We use the internet to replace as much as we possibly can, including proprietary networks, and we try to do everything from zero, which is to say that if we can build a better technology that doesn't exist anywhere, why wouldn't we? Because once that technology scales, you start having extreme advantages over your competitors. They don't really start to kick in until you have scale, but again, how do you scale? You have to start with actually getting customers. You have to get into the market, and in this case, I couldn't get into market without raising outside capital. That outside capital, thankfully, helped us launch a platform that consumers and businesses could use for virtually anything. It was a little bit of a Swiss Army knife, which later ended up being a deterrent, not something that made the company stronger. What you're seeing is actual transactions across Dwolla's platform that represent hundreds of millions of dollars, where it started creating a diaspora of connections where people were being pulled in with or without actually wanting to be a part of the network. And this happened somewhat organically, and it happened in a way that was actually really unhealthy for the company, and it was really unhealthy for me. I got way too much credit. I didn't necessarily understand what my usage looked like. People were flying me all over the world to talk about what was going to happen next. I was out evangelizing on behalf of the business, and I had people around me that were telling me that's what I was supposed to be doing, not in the business caring deeply about the technology that created the opportunity. All of this stuff, if you're not in it, looks like this beautiful thing that makes a company successful, and it's bullshit. There are times where things work, but again, it comes back to finding the right investors. And this period of time created a lot of economic inflow for Dwolla. There was another $20 million that came into the business in a relatively short period of time executing against that plan, and that plan was build the usage as big as we possibly can and figure out the rest later. As long as we can manage risk well, the technology scales, and banks don't come shut us off, this is gonna be great. Well, we did all that stuff well, but guess what? It still didn't work. And there was a night when I was driving back from Chicago, because I had to go to Chicago, because I needed to take a meeting in Chicago, and there weren't enough flights to get me to Chicago in the period of time I had to be there. So I got in the car, drove to Chicago, took the meetings. And the meetings were with people running very big, very important business units in massive global banks. And to this day, our technology is still sound, and a technology like ours or ours will solve the problem we were talking about. But the reality was, we just couldn't get the market to move. While all of our thesis around the technology was right, many of the things that we thought were true about the market adoption and distribution were just flat out wrong, and the timing was off. This is one of the few times in my life I remember screaming at the top of my lungs until I almost blacked out driving on the interstate. I started getting people on conference calls and just saying, no, we're changing it. It's different. this is not working. We don't know what's going to happen next. And it caused a change in our business. 18 months later, the revenue stream in the business looks dramatically different. The company is half the size that it used to be. We sell a completely different product into a completely different market with the exact same technology. So all the stuff that we built to service this really big pent-up need is still there. But what we ended up finding was by building that Swiss Army knife, we couldn't understand our customer. There was so much data and there were so many different things that were happening so fast that we couldn't get control of it. We couldn't understand it. And so, when I got started in this business, what I started under the assumption of is that there was a really big market. How big is the global FX market on a daily basis? I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars a day. We thought the internet could replace everything. We thought that if there was a better solution, everybody would use it. And over time, what we simply realized with investor guidance, I didn't realize all this stuff on my own. I had a really good group of people and a really smart group of people around me that, what we just simply ended up finding was that we didn't understand clearly enough our core growing customers because there was all this noise. And so when I think about what was the value to me in working with investors in this project, I think about, well, they've essentially given us another growth mode. They helped us to see what we needed to stop doing and focus on because there was just too much to do. And having too much to do, as everybody knows, can kill you. You only have so much bandwidth. You cannot manipulate time with anything other than money. And if you do, and it's not well directed, it's just expensive. Now many of our customers don't look like anything like us or like we used to. They're fast-growing technology companies that simply want to connect to banking infrastructure. Now, does anybody operate a business, and I recognize this is a super silly question, but does anybody operate a business that does not have to get money from its customers or send money to its vendors? What we realized is that businesses actually have the problem, not consumers. Businesses have a need to collect money and distribute it. And if you build the most efficient system to do that through APIs that acts in an invisible manner, you can provide a lot of value. The first company was a shoe marketplace that is actually doing incredibly well. It seems odd that there would be a massive market for $500 used Air Jordans, but there is. StockX is another great company that's doing it. So is Flight Club. Current is an application that is building a different type of bank for a different type of customer, connected internet first, where their infrastructure has to come from somewhere. These are companies where we're able to help them get into market faster. We're able to help their system scale faster because they're not having to build it from scratch and they're working with us. Nonetheless, we still have to be well capitalized. We have to manage risk over billions of dollars in transactions, and we have to staff it accordingly so that we can remain invisible and unobtrusive to our customers. And that's what Dwolla is. Dwolla is an API that helps software platforms move money. When a business and their operations are scaling, many times you want to automate. We heard this earlier in the marketing discussion. How do you do different automation or leverage automation to actually reduce costs? Well, money is just bits. And when you treat it as very important bits and replace all the checks, all the batch files, all the credit cards, and you just simply make it efficient with the internet, you can have gigantic savings. I do have investors, and I need them. I need their wisdom to help me build this company and distribute this product. And this is what our board looks like right now. Like Chris, I don't know if he is still employed at Twitter. He used to run Twitter's data business, but left to become a partner at Foundry. And these are some people that I'm really, really, really proud to work with. Each one of them has had different insights that have helped me build this business, which is big and is complex and still has a lot of hair on it. And there's still a lot of things that we need to figure out. But I recognize the value in what these gentlemen and their teams offer the company and what they offer me. It's not just them. I work with a group of people focused in Des Moines, Iowa. Some of these people are no longer with the company, and things change. But you can't fucking do everything alone. And at some point, if somebody wants to buy into your company to literally pay you to be on your team, that's not such a bad position to be in. Your investors are the only ones that pay you to be on your team. There are a lot of other reasons other people might join you, but I think that's worth appreciating, and there's a lot of value in that. As we think about knowing that you can't do everything yourself and being perfectly okay with it, I think there's some good ground rules as you start thinking about, well, if I'm going to raise capital in my business, how should I start? I'm going to give you some simple frameworks, but some ground rules. Don't insult your team, don't insult your customers, don't insult your investors, and don't spend more money than you have. Very basic things. But each time you do them, it makes your business super unattractive. Sometimes you hear business owners griping about how difficult it was to serve that customer. Like, those are people I never want to buy from and I never want to work with. And I know I'm not alone in that. It's a little bit of a faux pas. Not quitting is an obvious one. But companies die because founders quit or they run out of money. I say to people, don't quit unless you need to. And if you need to, well, you just killed your company and be okay with that. I want to share a couple other learning lessons from companies locally that I've been involved in. I say locally because there might be a lot of things not local which don't have a lot of context. And I think one of the things that's important for us to do here is for us to talk about what works and what doesn't. Hopefully you'll find that I'm being very frank with you all in a very transparent way about things that aren't working. But it's important because that's how we learn. These are companies that, local in some capacity, I've all either like helped stand up or invested in or owned part of or something at some point in time. And each one of them had different outcomes. All of them very positive, all with really great learning lessons. Clusterflunk was an education platform that I invested in that eventually ended up raising a little over $1 million. Looks like everything is absolutely working. Didn't work, pivoted into a software product to sell directly to teachers. Didn't work, shut the company down. Both of the guys moved to the Bay Area, work for a Bitcoin company now. It's fine. Kind of didn't work. But what did work is I learned a lot, their careers grew, and ultimately, that is a big part of early stage investing. We invest to give people a shot. We as communities give people a shot every day when we download their app or we start using a new piece of software or a tool that's not built here. But maybe we need to be more thoughtful about, like, maybe we won't get the money back, and that's okay. What will the community learn as a result? Egg Crates was a company that I started with Jeff Wood. And what I learned in working with Jeff was, well, first and foremost, don't use your key supplier as another company you own, especially after you sell it to the employees. It was eventually shut down because the supplier became problematic, and that was that. What I learned from that was I really like working with Jeff. I've subsequently started another company with him. VineMe was supposed to be a timeline for the world, and I was not a founder. I was just kind of advising and trying to help it along. Nonetheless, what ended up happening was the domain ended up to be more valuable than the actual product. Twitter, when it had Vine, ended up buying the domain, which actually created a little bit of a return. Everybody got like a little check, but at the end of it, Twitter then shut down Vine. Tickly was a project to simply take fees and out of the buying process for, well, people that wanted to go to concerts and make it actually cheaper so they weren't getting hosed. Not too dissimilar than taking transaction fees out of the equation entirely, like with Dwolla. But in reality, like, I ended up having time to work on it. Emma ended up taking it, ended up building a very real company. And Tickly is still around and doing well and has externally gone on to have multiple different partners and investors and exists today. Clay and Milk is a project that I'm working on now with Jeff again that is designed to help tell stories about companies in the middle. The thesis is that if you don't tell stories and you don't tell what's good and what's bad, we're not discoverable and communities can't connect. It brings me to, like, again, what is your purpose? Why are you doing this? This is all an important part of actually raising capital, because if you don't think about what your purpose is and be comfortable with what that failure could be, like, the likelihood that it is going to work is relatively low. And so when I think about, like, my purpose with Dwolla is to build the ideal API to move money. It's to connect software globally to actually eradicate transaction costs. And the reason that's important is because it takes a lot of money out of businesses in the United States, and then when you go out globally, you can actually give back 15 to 20% of people's money simply because of the way they're being paid. If somebody told you, I'm going to pay you in this way and you're going to get paid 15% more money for doing the same job, would that have an impact on your life? Of course it would. Of course it would. With Clay and Milk, It's something I'm not involved in on a daily basis. I'm not the CEO of the business. I don't have a day-to-day role, but I think it's absolutely worth talking about because I believe people can't stay here unless they find mentors that help them build their businesses. They find like-minded people that make them feel like they're not a total alien, and that we recognize there are people out there that want to help us. Whether or not I'm trying to find an investor, a customer, or a mentor, if none of those things appear to be in your backyard, we lose a lot of people to the East and West Coast. For 2 years, I was one of them. I'm not saying that I'm the center of the universe, but I am saying that as I believe Dwolla is going to be more and more and more successful, that we will have a positive impact, hopefully, on the community. I love being here. I want to stay here. I don't want to leave. And that's why I came back. But this time, I want to make sure that I'm doing everything I can in the community to try and share what is good here and what is going on that we can help one another connect. And part of that is starting with the basics around fundraising, because I think that it's an often overlooked thing here. And so as we think about your focus, again, we come back to, do you really want to raise capital? Is your focus on a return for your investors? Is it a return for you? Sure, everybody likes getting paid, and that sounds like a really fun thing, but getting paid out of a venture-funded investment is actually a relatively difficult situation. I hear somebody laughing because obviously you've lived through it. Is it return for your community? Like, all of these things are fine. Some actual motivations don't need to be financial, and that's a good thing. Or you can find a passion between it not being financial and it being financially beneficial for multiple parties. That's a really great situation to be in. The other question to ask yourself is, do the returns really matter? Did you start a business because you didn't want a different job? Maybe you shouldn't take other people's money because it will actually make you miserable. And so as we think about the advantages and sort of the economics between just you versus other people, the path is basically the same. I'm oversimplifying it, as I've been told I have a tendency to do from time to time. But in theory, starting and building and launching a company kind of looks like this: idea, plan, fund, execute. It's going to take time or money or both. If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't think about how to do it, it's never going to happen. The proof becomes an execution. So whether or not it's with your money or other people's money, the path is exactly the same. And I would advise you to be your first investor. The key piece that matters in building value, in that I mean building value and earning customers. Either way, you don't execute, you die. You lose your money, you lose your time, you lose other people's money, you lose their time. Everything is in execution. And the question becomes, as a part of the execution, do you need other people's money? Always think first and foremost how to do it without other people's money. Do you just need a co-founder? Like, is your deficiency in the planning stage? Is it in the execution stage? Where? You start with looking at yourself naked in the mirror and thinking, what sucks about me? And then you find a co-founder that fills that gap. Don't start with trying to pay somebody to fill that gap. Find somebody who deeply believes in the problem you're trying to solve and in the project. And maybe if you have the right co-founders and you still need help somewhere, specifically on the execution side, maybe it's time to consider investors. Now, investors don't like being just money unless you're already a success. Because if that's the case, you are far more risky than the 10% return they're going to get out of that Betterment account. Like, it's not hard to get those returns anymore, folks. And so when you're talking to an investor who is going to pay you to be a part of your team, I would beg you to consider that you should think about it as, how are they going to have fun working with you? And then what can come out of that? So I put in a pro tip. If you need money, look for it in all the places that you're wasting it. Do you really need a brand new iPhone 7? Do you need a new MacBook Pro? Did you overspend on your car? Could you live in a smaller place? Do you need to go out to eat that often? We all tend to have extra money laying around just in our behaviors. And it's a good place to look. Another one is that if it's your company, be the first money in. It is a lot easier to raise capital when you're talking about putting your own money in and leading with your feet. When I raised initial money for Dwolla, I was the first money in. I've invested in Dwolla in at least one subsequent round since then and very recently. I want to be involved. I want to put my own capital in. There was a time where that wasn't necessarily welcome, but I'm glad to say that those times are over. Last pro tip, give a shit. This is your most powerful weapon of all things in business, with your customers, with your investors, is just to care deeply and be genuine and tell the truth. Never underestimate the power of giving a shit. Basics in raising capital, the first one is understanding some stages. So when you think about stages, in the press, stages seem to get more sexy the bigger or later the stage is. So when we in the Midwest start reading tech blogs and things like that about big Series A, big Series B, huge, biggest seed round in history, blah, 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 like all this really means is the further down the stages you get, the less ownership you have. So if you're not managing that almost magically, which some people can, every time that you do it, you're giving up your ownership. So you want to make sure you get something in return for that. Good team members that want to help you build the company might be a good trade-off. Also, they can start opening you up to other markets that otherwise you could never get in and helping you run the business better. That's okay. It's just something good for us all to be self-aware of. With no outside money, you can retain 100% of the company. But would that result maybe in you one day selling the company to the wrong person? Well, I never asked myself or Google that question at one point, but I'm humble enough to know I don't know everything, and I'm okay with that. There are a lot of investors in the world and a lot of people that have built really fantastic businesses that have seen a lot of the problems that I'm experiencing now, have in the past, and will in the future, that I would love their advice. Some are kind enough to return my phone calls when I call them, and if they do well as a result of the company doing well when they're giving me that type of advice, is that okay? Sure, absolutely. Deal structure. So when you're raising capital initially, I started with the basics, so I recognize this is going to be very basic for some of you, but I think from a basics perspective, when you go to raise capital, let's assume that you're starting with 100% of your business. Maybe that's split up between co-founders, I don't know. A lot of investors are going to want 30% of your company, regardless of the amount. You'll want to give them 5 or less, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. If it's not, don't go to raise capital because you're going to sound like a loon when you all of a sudden say they should get 2% for $1 million. Because the numbers do actually mean something. When you think about how valuation works, when you own 100% of something, valuation is just whatever you say it is. You could have no customers or 100 customers or 1 million customers. When you say it's worth X, that's all it is. It's just a number picked out of thin air. There's not a science to it. It's just, what do you think it is? And then is the market willing to pay that? But once the market actually pays something for it, let's say that I put $100,000 into your business and I get 10% of it for that. Well, you got $1 million company. Except, who's going to buy it? Who's going to give you that much money for your percentage of the company? That's another mistake people make, is like paper gains don't matter, folks. In order for it to be worth that and for you actually to get paid that, somebody's got to be willing to pay you for it. Likewise, when we start having conversations about, well, do I want $1 million at 30% or 10%? Well, the post money on the deal is very different. And again, these are terms that it's good for you to know going into a negotiation because they matter. And quite frankly, you could get really screwed. If it wasn't for Mike and JD in this room, I would have gotten really screwed in a few deals. Also, talk to Mike and JD when you're raising capital. Now, when you think about other people's valuations, it's also very easy to look at things like a tech blog and say, well, they raised this much money at this price, and it looks like this is the key KPI that they did it on. All you can do is look at that again as which way the wind is blowing. It doesn't actually have bearing. It's an argument that an intelligence person in a room will quickly refute and prove to be untrue. So it's a good way to look at what's valuable and what's not in the marketplace. But as far as private early stage companies go, it's not a good place to be creating arguments from. Something else we don't talk about here a lot is preference. When you take somebody's money, they get paid first. So let's say I put $1 million into your business, and that business sells for $1 million. Let's say you spend 5 years creating that company. Who do you think gets the $1 million? You or me? I definitely do. I get all of it. And so when you think about whether or not that's a situation that you want to put yourself in, you should consider it before raising capital. And you should very, very, very very carefully take time to understand how preference and liquidation preference works. Because even in small deals, it absolutely matters. And how boards work. Let's say all of a sudden you have the ability to raise $1 million for 10%, so would you be willing to give up 50% of the company to raise $5 million? Well, effectively, you've now lost control of the company, which means you effectively now work for other people and can be fired. Super important things that when you're thinking about the deal structures in your businesses to consider. Many people believe that in order for a board to pass something major, everybody has to agree. That's like sort of true. By and large, a majority passes a lot of things. And so when you start taking on that outside capital and creating real governance in a company, you increase risk if you don't think this is a great thing. For somebody like me, I actually really enjoy this. I think having so many good, intelligent, experienced people at the table that have a stake in the game actually is a huge advantage to me. Because I would rather have a smaller amount of something really important than a bigger amount of something that I don't know what to do with. If you need to raise capital because the only missing ingredient is capital, it's going to be really expensive. And so I would encourage you to think, how, when I'm raising capital, does this accelerate what is working? How does it help me take my 5-year plan and do it in 2 years? You're taking success and making it more attainable with the outside capital as opposed to just talking about how you're going to spend it and executing well against it. And this is a tough thing, but I think it needs to be said because sometimes when I hear from founders locally and they talk to me about their valuation expectations, they're crazy. They're crazy because they got them off TechCrunch. Don't do that. Now, we're in the Midwest. One of the beautiful things about the Midwest is everything is cheaper. My life is 3.75x more expensive in San Francisco than it is in Des Moines, Iowa, and that doesn't account for inflation over the last year. It's probably 4.5 now. And so maybe we don't need to raise as much capital, and maybe our valuations don't need to be the same, and maybe we don't need the same tricky preferences. I don't know. But when you're out raising capital and you get on a plane and you go out to the Bay Area, you have to price into the round that this guy you really think can help you and be a part of your board hates flying. And to get through Minneapolis, do you know what airport you go through? Or when you go to San Francisco, you have to go through Minneapolis. That's literally a 2-day investment for somebody who can probably afford their own private jet but doesn't fly enough to actually justify it. That's a pain in their ass. They're not going to give you a bump on your valuation for creating something that actually inconveniences them helping you. It's okay, but it's something that you should know going into it, is that being here, you might take a 50 to 65% haircut on your valuation in comparison to your peers in other parts of the country. Difficult, but true. Also, it means that building companies here has one primary way to have a great outcome. It's to build a great revenue-producing company. Because there are not big tech giants in Des Moines, Iowa to acqui-hire up good teams. Which means the best way to create safety for yourself, your investment, and your team is to create a real sustainable business. Well, Midwest people are pretty practical. And so I think that's going to be a compliment to a lot of people in the way they run their businesses in here. Done correctly, raising capital can help you manipulate time. I believe this wholeheartedly. And the reason I say is because each one of us only has so many units of energy in a day. The only way to get more energy is to get more people or write better code. Sometimes there's expertise you need to do both better. You can only throw so much time and energy at a problem with will. And outside capital can actually help you break down barriers by building a team highly focused on accomplishing things that you yourself might actually need 10 years to accomplish in far less time. I think it's good to consider what is the lowest valuation possible that you're comfortable with the least amount of cash that you need. Because this helps you not get out over your skis. You cannot divorce your investors. I don't know how many people in the room have been through a divorce, but that's not an option with your investors. If you do not get along, the likely outcome is that your company will die. I feel like I need to smile because this just sounds so depressing, but people need to have this information here. Otherwise, it just happens, and then you feel ugly when you learn it of, oh my God, I can't believe this is going on. So then you gotta call people to find out whether or not they're really trying to screw you or not, and it's sort of like nobody really wants to be mean. But guys, this is common stuff. And raising capital is a means to an end. Fundraising stories tell us something completely different, but what is the end? You should know what that is when you take in external capital. Whether or not that's a huge, sustainable business that goes public, or you're just trying to get out as fast as you can, or you're trying to flip it into this other corporate entity. The likely outcome for investors is if you don't know what the end state is, or have an idea of what it could be, it's not exactly that interesting. I mentioned this earlier, but investors are the only ones that pay you to be on your team. Imagine having somebody and being so good at what you do that an investor is willing to say, I will give you $100,000 to help build your business, and I'll work for free. Oh, and by the way, I have 50 years of experience behind me. That same level of experience, what would that cost you to go hire? Now, what happens if you can do that with 5 different people? What type of brain power and access can you get all over the world by having access to those brains and that time, where they're buying in to get you to listen? With the right people, you can do a lot of really amazing things, and ultimately, I believe this is the right reason to raise capital. Again, my name is Ben Milne. I can be accessed on Twitter very easily as BP Milne. I hope that I did not depress you. If you disagree with anything I said, please, let's have it out kindly. But if you want to jump in on something, or you're working on a term sheet and you want me to read it, I'll sign an NDA or something, I don't care. But if you need help, if you're negotiating a contract with a key customer and you don't know what this clause means, or it's got something around how investors are going to treat you in the future, seriously, send it to me. I will help you. I will read it. And if I don't know, I will refer you to somebody who I hope will help you. Thank you so much for your time. I'm just going to stand up here awkwardly and ask if there are any questions at all. Yes, sir.
Maybe.
If you want to just yell at me,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Check, check.
Can we get some juice here? Yeah, so break in here. Go for it.
Yeah, so today there's a lot of lingo around validating your idea, validating the market, product market fit. Can you speak to Dwolla? You knew it was a large capital expenditure. What did you do to vet out the product market fit, number one? And then number two, how did you sell that, sell that to investors when maybe you didn't have, product to show them yet?
I think it's important in Dwolla's case to think about it as 2 separate companies. Company 1, and Company 1 was, the illusion is there's product market fit because people are using it, right? But that's not really product market fit. Product market fit is when people are paying you for it, and not paying you tidbits, paying you real amounts of money that are building a real sustainable business. Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing, 1, 2, 3. So I think with investors with sort of Company 1, in full transparency, it was, oh my God, look how fast this thing is growing. We need to hire more people because, oh my God, we just can't do all this. And that went on for 4 years, to the time where all of a sudden you kind of get enough time to step back and say, what is the business here? Well, that business wasn't selling to consumers, and that was the whole product that the business initially was built on. So when we changed it, we started taking the technology and selling it to companies. And the easy validator for the company was we were able to say, yeah, that'll cost $2,000 a month. And they said, okay. And then we just kept doing that and kept doing that and kept doing that, got rid of all the old products. And now when we're talking to an investor about what's exciting about the business, what's exciting about the business is the revenue growth, the margin growth, and how many customers there are still to sell to. If you can start describing how many customers that you have to sell to, what those customers are worth to you, and how many of those customers you currently have as an existing customer, I mean, you've got a pretty good starting point. Like, you kind of know where to run from there.
Yeah, hi Ben.
Hey.
Same hairdresser. So I've got a question about your investors and how you vetted them on a personal basis, on an emotional basis. You know, like building a building is pretty complex, but not many fall down. But when it comes to relationships, humans aren't that great at them, and often they do fall down. So what did you take into consideration when talking to investors about the way they behave and spoke with you, you know, before you got involved?
What I learned over time is that it's a very personal relationship. That's all there is to it. And when you work that closely with somebody, you become more like the people that you work with. So an easy indicator at this point, at least for me, is this somebody that I want to be more like or less like? From there, it's, do we agree that this is the path for the business? Do we believe that these are the right strategic problems to solve? And do you want to work on that together? The good news is the investor community, although it seems at times quite large and although at times quite small, can be quite insular, which is a good thing for companies as they grow. What I mean by that is you end up with people around you that also don't want this thing to get screwed up. And they help you vet people. In the early days, I was very fortunate that an investor by the name of Albert Wanger from Union Square Ventures invested in the business and became our partner. Initially, as some people in this room can attest to, it was a very difficult negotiation. And Albert completely unannounced, after I got a little bit upset, got on a plane and I found him on the couch in the office the next morning waiting for me to get to work. Albert has taught me a lot about how to work with the right investors. I can't take credit for it. A lot of the things that I now know as best practices, like just that simple, do I want to be more like or less like this person? A lot of it has to do with working with Albert. I'm really thankful for that, man.
So you talked about company one and company two, and I'm curious because company one seems like there are a whole bunch of network effects with like a peer-to-peer system, and company two seems more enterprise focused and kind of more of a commodity API play. I'm curious about that transition, and like especially the investors who invest in the first type of company may not be the same or the right investors for the second type of company. Can you talk about the transition and what's been challenging about it and how you've overcome that?
Well, the transition is really interesting because when I was running the speaker company, I was only ever talking to customers. And I was only talking to customers really with my day with people that were calling me. I was doing sales all day. But when I was talking about how we get this other company off the ground, dude, I was going to every bank that would possibly meet with me saying, this is what I want to do. This is what I think could happen. You're going to have all this risk. You're not going to make any money. And so you want to do this deal? And like, that's where I started. And so that was a 2-year learning process of just simply realizing that, you know, every business is dramatically and fundamentally different. But even as you talk about sort of network effects in the first business, I didn't know what a network effect was until I started reading about how do I describe this thing which is occurring in my software in this new business. It is funny. Like, the world creates these really amazing opportunities that really do change your life. And in my case, like, it's been the internet and access to people. But, you know, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I don't know that I can be used as like a great like example other than like I had to learn so much of it for the first time.
I guess I meant more between like Dwolla stage 1, stage 2, rather than speaker company Dwolla.
Got it. I apologize. Thank you for the clarification. You know, in actuality, when talking to investors about those two different businesses, it is true that those investors are different, and on either side, one might not interest the other. Union Square Ventures is an interesting crossover, as is Foundry, but like Andreessen Horowitz, for example, really excited about what the consumer ramifications were for building a new type of internet-focused, almost Visa. But building infrastructure that is used by other parties, which put their brand on something, completely different workflow. And in that, I agree with everything you said, with one kind of key exception, is that the infrastructure itself that Dwolla built to be able to facilitate these things at scale is fundamentally the same regardless of the customer. And what we ended up finding was that businesses were willing to pay us way more money for features than they were for transactions. That was like a light bulb when we figured that out. It allowed us to say that that feature is $1,000 a month without ever talking about what a transaction costs. And the transaction cost as it scales is a bit like data costs. It only goes in one direction until it hits a floor, and that floor with data looks like electricity and physical storage. With payments, it looks like a fee from the Federal Reserve. Is that better the second time around? All right, we'll try it over beer later if that's okay.
On kind of that same point, I kind of wondered what your investors' reaction was when you had the light bulb for the pivot. Like, did you have a fight?
I don't know if I'd call it a fight. Like our board is different. Our team is different. Not every conversation was a lot of fun. Discovery is sometimes followed by a meaningful amount of change, and in our case, that's totally true. However, that light bulb did not coincide with that drive back from Chicago. I will never forget the way that I felt that night. I have never been more angry, I have never been more frustrated, and I have never been more confused than I was on that drive. I didn't know exactly what all the steps were to get to the next step. I just knew that we needed to put a bow on what it is that we were doing because we didn't have enough control over our own destiny. That realization is something that I believe once we had a meaningful conversation, everybody was excited about. Because if you're investing millions of dollars in a project and the founder and the CEO is saying to you, I don't believe that we can control our own destiny on this project, I don't think you're going to try and change their mind. And in this case, thankfully, I received a lot of support. The business changed as a result. The transition of those changes took a full 18 months to the point where I can actually get out of the business now and be doing things like talking about raising capital. So I'm very fortunate that I work with investors that have been really supportive throughout the entire process. Not an easy one, but they were supportive. Okay, time to get off the stage. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ben. That was great.